I felt a failure. I felt I was letting him down. I was trying to get the square peg into the round hole. And what emotion coaching did was let me look under the iceberg and start to realize that instead of judging him for his behavior or judging him for his needs and so on, to understand them.
Welcome to the Beautiful Reality of Autism podcast, where we talk to inspiring parents of autistic children and autistic people themselves who've gone on to make a real difference, as well as thought leaders and researchers in the world of autism. Our aim is to give you as autism parents the tools, the insights, the inspiration and the hope to build those critical and essential relationships with your autistic child and a safe environment around them to bring out the best in them and give them the best chances of success and fulfillment in the future. The name, The Beautiful Reality of Autism, comes from the name of my TED Talk, which presents our own distinctive and empowering conception of autism and which has now been seen by more than 350,000 people. It can be found on YouTube. At Transforming Autism, all of our activities are geared towards that goal of improving relationships and creating safe environments for autistic children. We've got our in-person First Steps program. We've got the online series of workshops called Confident Autism Parenting, which run periodically. We've got a number of other new services launching as well. You can find out a lot more on our website, transformingautism.org. But today we are speaking with Janet Rose, Dr. Janet Rose, principal of Norland College, who actually worked with us in developing our First Steps program and making it what it is. But Janet is also the parent of an autistic son, and she's also one of the founders of Emotion Coaching, which is about helping autistic children and parents of autistic children, I guess, to create the sorts of relationships that we're talking about. So welcome to the podcast, Janet. It's great to have you.
Hello. Oh, hi, Guy. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here, actually. I just so love the title of your program. It's wonderful. And the work that you're doing is so powerful and so important. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm sure everybody will be saying the same about your work as well at the end of this episode. So tell us about, how things started out for you when you had your son. What was the story? How were things in the early days?
So my son is now 28. So we're going back to the previous century, actually. He was born in 1997. I was, at that time, I was a primary school teacher trained, working, and but I had gone on to do further study. I'm essentially an early years specialist, I guess, and sort of with a reasonable understanding of child development. I had done a master's by then. I was doing my PhD by then. And so I came into parenthood thinking, I know, all there is to know about children and babies and what to do and so on. And along came my son. And he has given me permission to share our journey. He didn't want to be part of this podcast, but we have talked together about what I would like to share, and he's comfortable with that. So when he was born, he wasn't quite what I had thought things would be, because right from the very beginning, I make a joke, which I'm not sure is appropriate anymore, but my son is very comfortable that I express it in this way. But I say in many respects, it felt to me like he was born in a bad mood. And, this sort of joyful experience was tricky from the beginning. He is happy that I express it in that way. There began a sort of an interesting journey where I realized fairly quickly that I had a child that was not going to sleep very easily. He barely slept, that had digestive challenges, that had sensory challenges, but in other respects was developing in the way one would expect. So my son wasn't obviously well, it wasn't obvious to me, even though I had had experience of working with autistic children and so on as an educator. He, for example, he didn't tick all the kind of cliche textbook sort of autistic traits. For example, he was a very early talker. So he was talking in sentences when he was 1 year old and already starting to read when he was 2. So in many ways, his communication skills were actually way above average. So, and my understanding, and we are going back nearly 30 years, of course, my understanding is completely different now, but, back then, the common or sort of understanding was that children who are autistic would have difficulty with communication. And that wasn't the problem, if you like, or not. I don't like using the word problem, but that wasn't the concern, shall we say. There were other things, like I've already explained. And we then went on, I guess we're still on our journey of deepening each other's understanding of autism. He actually didn't get officially diagnosed until he was an adult. I suspected it by the time he was a toddler. But because there were other aspects that were developing in a way that wasn't necessarily leading me to think, oh, he has autism, it wasn't completely clear. And back then, being autistic was perceived differently as it is today. And that's where the work that you're doing is so important, because the culture has changed in society and it still has a long way to go, I think. But there is a better understanding. There is there is a greater acceptance. And I now think, wrongly, I should have got him formally diagnosed. Instead, I had him informally diagnosed by the time he was 9, and he was autistic. But I decided to not make it a formal diagnosis because back then, and we're talking about early 2000s by this point, I felt that it was a label. And one of the most liberating things for him and for me is that we are no longer perceiving it in this way, that it's, there is something wrong with him if he's labeled. And so that, to me, is just an example of how culture has changed, societal values and attitudes, and of course our knowledge and understanding of autism. Because, and I don't like to use the term high functioning or low functioning, but he was what we used to call high functioning. He was very good at things like sport. So he was very capable academically. He was on a scholarship program. So there were many aspects where that it was quite clear that I felt he didn't need to be labelled, if that makes sense. But I think I did him an injustice in doing that.
What were the challenges in those very early years?
So the challenges, I think, largely was the challenges he had in regulating his emotions. The challenge, although this did not manifest in school at all, just in the home. So he was easily dysregulated. The challenges we had with his sleeping, the challenges we had with his sensory sensitivities. So, for example, it would take a lot long. We had to go through particular rituals at bedtime in order to get into a place and space where he felt relaxed. There had to be a certain pillow and a certain duvet. We had to make sure that no light was coming through. So he had blackout blinds, and then I would have to tape the curtain to the wall to ensure no light came out through, for example. So it was just me and the family adapting and adjusting to his sensory sensitivities and he didn't like change. I felt I had to prepare him. I used to say I used to have to take 2 years to prepare him for a change because transitions were difficult for him. So that's what I mean by challenges. And the biggest one for me and the most enlightening moment for me was the way in which I judged him for his behaviour. Which I'm now ashamed of and heartbroken about, and we've had some very healing times together. And although I was not I don't believe in corporal punishment, and I didn't follow any of the traditional, time out, naughty step. I didn't do any of that, but I definitely came with this kind of teacher perspective of children need to behave, and all I did was look at his surface behaviour. And I didn't necessarily make the links between his potential autism and his behaviour. For me, he was like, you've got to behave, you should be behaving, and you need to behave. Now I think completely differently.
It's a part of a journey that many of us go through, and you did say at the beginning, you made that contrast between what the expectation was of, having a child and it being a sort of smooth and joyful experience. And it turned into something that was much more challenging than that. And, that's also a very common experience that parents have when their children don't fit into the mold of their expectations. How was that for you emotionally in those very early times?
Oh, well, I mean, I was filled with angst and fear and uncertainty, and I had come in with this sort of, I know about this, I'm in early years, I've done a master's, I'm doing a PhD, and, I had to, it was very humbling. I mean, because I realized that I had to rethink everything. And so I felt a failure. I felt I was letting him down. It still is an intensely emotional experience as a parent anyway. And then add into the mix that things aren't going as as society perceives it should. And the way that I had assumptions about how it should be, I really had to sort of unlearn and relearn everything. And that was an emotional journey. And I suppose I think I felt like I was failing him all the time. And that we had this sort of angst-filled relationship and we just sort of muddled through, as it were.
And I guess that's what we're all about as a charity, what you're all about in your work, I think, as well, is about helping parents who inevitably go through that phase to move on to something different. So tell us about how that was for you. What was it that got you to the point where you thought this isn't going to be a long-term way of managing to survive? I've got to do something different. How did you come to that stage, and how did you work through that?
So I started reading. I started looking. I started trying to find out, all the stuff out there on sleep, for example. What can I do? And I felt that, the information that was out there, and we were only talking about the earliest days of the internet now, of course, back then, but I didn't feel like it was speaking to me and speaking to my son, particularly because he was this so-called high functioning, and because I wasn't ready to accept that he was autistic. I think that's another important point to make. Not because I thought that was a shameful thing, but because I didn't want him to feel shameful. Because back then, I think it was perceived as there's something wrong with you, as opposed to it was a deficit model, as opposed to the much more affirming model that we are trying to and have started to change in the world. So I didn't want him to feel that there was something different about him. I wanted him to feel that he was part of everything. And because he was able to function reasonably well, particularly in school, for the most part, he did have some friends, but I knew that at the end of I now know that he was masking to the massively. I now realize, and I can talk about the very revelatory conversations we've had about exactly how he was feeling. If you'd like to explore that, because I find it fascinating understanding what was actually going on in his head, because I wasn't as aware as I could have been. So I started searching for answers, for help, to try and think, what can I do? And I came across, through my sister actually, emotion coaching, which is a parenting style which wasn't invented or created, it was observed. And it was based on a family therapist, a chap called John Gottman from America, who coined the term with his researchers, and noticed that there were certain things that certain parents did with children that had better outcomes. Not necessarily autistic children, but with any child. And these better outcomes, included, academic outcomes, social outcomes, resilience. They had better health, all sorts of things. So, although this wasn't particularly a book about supporting autistic children, it really spoke to me, because what I realised I was doing was judging him for his behaviour instead of looking beneath the iceberg of behaviour. Behaviour is the bit on the top that you see. I was not looking underneath to think what's going on. I was trying to fix the problem, solve the problem, help him sleep, let him be less sensitive, that sort of thing. And
trying to get him to conform to what society's expectations are.
Exactly. And trying to get, that, I know there's a company called Square Peg Round Hole. I was trying to get the square peg into the round hole. And what emotion coaching did was let me look under the iceberg and start to realize that instead of judging him for his behavior or judging him for his needs and so on, to understand them and to work with him and with them. And one of the most powerful aspects of emotion coaching, and it's really just a way of communicating with the child. And there are many other tools in the toolkit. This isn't just the one thing, of course. But what it does is it changes your mindset, because, yes, obviously there needs to be appropriate social behaviour. But what kind of social behaviour, and what are we talking about? Obviously, you can't hit people, shout at people, scream at people, So there are certain social behaviours that for any child is not okay. But what it did is let me kind of start to see how he was thinking. And I remember him saying to me when he was five, he said, "I think differently from everyone else."
At 5, you said 5 years old?
He said that at 5.
So he was aware even at that very early age?
Oh, but of course he didn't know what it was. He just knew he thought differently. And I didn't pay enough attention to that. I thought, well, that's interesting. And I thought, oh, maybe that's, I think he has some autistic traits, so maybe it's that. But I still wasn't ready or willing or able to say I have an autistic son. It was more, I've got a son who's got some quirks and some challenges and difficulties with behaviour in the home, but, I work around them and so on and so forth. And then as time went on, when I got the informal diagnosis that back then it was Asperger's, but I know we don't use that term so much anymore, and I decided not to have, tell the school or anything like that. What I did start to do is use emotion coaching. So that meant that I was tuning into how he was feeling rather than judging his behavior. And that's the essence of emotion coaching, is you look beneath the iceberg, you try and empathize and validate how they're feeling, but not accepting the behavior. So there's still consequences and expectation setting around certain behaviors.
So can you give an example of putting that into practice and what difference it made to him?
Oh, yeah. So for example, so say we would be in a shop and he is not comfortable or happy about his end of school day. And so he's angry and dysregulated and wants to kick me, for example. Previously, it would have been, it's not okay to kick me. It would be a stern response and, limit setting and cutting to the chase. with emotion coaching, what I started to do is I'd say, Cameron, you're not feeling okay. Something's not okay. I understand that. You know it's not okay to kick me, but I understand you're not feeling okay. I think you're not okay at the moment, so we're going to leave the shop and go until you feel calmer and feel okay again. And what we would then do is, so it's a whole different way of thinking about behaviour, and it's trying to connect with how he was feeling and help him on a journey of labelling his feelings, of understanding his feelings, understanding that he's in a stress response, that he doesn't necessarily even know himself why he's feeling like this. So it's not an interrogation where you say, what's the matter? What's wrong? What are you feeling? Why are you doing this? It's not an interrogation. It's a calming, soothing, relational encounter in the moment where I'm trying to connect with what he's feeling. We can worry about the behavior later. Right then, he was in a stress state and we need to get him calm. And I then went on a journey of learning about and understanding our neurophysiology, so how our brains work, how our body works, which are not, that dissimilar. Now, we obviously understand a lot about autistic brains now, of course, in terms of processing information, but we still got the same kind of stress response, all humans do. And understanding that and the science behind it helped me to, because it is an evidence-based strategy and is supported by the science, I was able to, in that moment, focus on calming him and soothing him so he could start to be practicing calming his stress response rather than focusing on his behavior.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess in that sort of situation in the shop, he's expressing emotions that he doesn't fully understand. He needs support. He needs help to just understand those emotions. And if we react in, the traditional way of like, what are you doing? This is not acceptable. What we're actually doing is we're shutting, rather than helping him understand, we're giving him the message, and he's open to receiving messages at that point because he's needing to work out what's going on. Exactly. We're telling him what you're feeling is wrong. Your way of being who you are, your way of responding, your confusion, your stress and your struggle and your difficulty is actually wrong. And we're sort of compounding it, and we're sort of adding an extra layer of intensity to the emotions that are building up in them. Whereas when you just acknowledge it and you just say, okay, this is where you are. Let's help you. Help you work out what this is about. Let's help you find the way through. That must be so transformative for him. But what did it take for you to be able to do that?
Absolutely. So, I mean, you've summarised it beautifully there, Guy. And it is about them when they're in a calmer state. Then you can work with them. Then you can use the logic and the rational problem solving in an age
because they're open and they trust you. Because
and depending on how verbal they are and all sorts of things. So using other tools to support that, of course. Yes. So I think for me, in terms of changing my attitude, my values, my beliefs, my understanding, it did take me some time because I had a very clear mindset. I myself had been, enculturated to believe and have certain values and insights into children's behaviour and what they should and shouldn't do. So I had to change my own understanding and my own belief system about behaviour and how you should respond to it. And some people think emotion coaching is too soft. It's letting children get away with bad behaviour. It's not. It's not at all. It is supporting children's self-regulation. And this is especially important for children who are autistic because they may have more challenges. If they have challenges processing information in a different way, or if they have more difficulty and have greater sensitivity, as my son did, for example, then they may need more support and more help to regulate and to learn to self-regulate. So they need it more, you could argue. But I would say emotion coaching is for all children for all
Yeah.
humans.
Well, I find that as well. It's like, what's best practice for autistic children is actually ultimately best practice for everybody. It's just that autistic children are showing us how important it is because they need it in order to function. Whereas, yeah. And you did say earlier, I mean, on that point, you said that you had some experiences that you'd be willing to share of what your son's experiences were in those early days before you came to the emotion coaching. And that might actually be quite helpful for parents to hear, to understand what, every child is different, but to understand what might be going through the head of a child who doesn't feel like they're being validated by their parent.
Absolutely. And I think that change in the way I responded to him, the way I understood him, took time for me to learn a new way of thinking and doing, and took time for us to then, in our relationship, to get more in sync together. And it did get to the point when he was 18 where he said, "Don't tell me how I'm feeling." So, but what it did was create an emotional bridge for us that I don't think I would have had in quite the same way. And it has meant now that I don't have to almost verbalize how he might be feeling. I don't have to communicate that empathy in such an explicit way that I needed to do when he was younger, because it just sits there between us. He knows I am a safe haven, and he knows that I will empathize with and understand and validate his feeling. And that safe space, we know this from the science of this, that enables him to then open up and, talk and share and so on. So our brains prioritize safety over thinking, for example. So so now we have our relationship is much more in sync and much, much stronger. So we now are able to talk together and reflect on the journey. And it's very interesting now that he's an adult, what he tells me. So, for example, I gave the example of what he said to me when he was 5. So we've explored this way he thinks differently. And this is particularly true when it comes to social encounters. So a lot of people think that people who are autistic lack empathy. But in fact, we now know that's not true at all. In fact, I now realize that my son was much more sensitive to my emotions, more so than his sister. So I have a daughter who is not autistic, and he was much more sensitive to my mood. So, and even now, when I see him as an adult, I notice that he is checking me out. He's this idea of lack of eye contact, for example. It's not that. It's as we know, it's about being overwhelmed with the sensory information. But he's almost searching me to check, where am I with my emotions? And so one of the great things about emotion coaching as well is that it is as much about the adult self-regulation as it is about supporting the child to self-regulate. So I am so much better at regulating my feelings and emotions so that I can be that safe adult for my child.
So tell us a bit about that. How does that manifest, and what does it take from you to be able to do that?
Oh, again, it's hard because my character or my temperament is, quick to erupt, quick to react. I'm very, I'm definitely not slow to warm up. I'm very, so I've had to learn to regulate my own emotions first before I can co-regulate and support my son with his and his behaviour and so on. Although he's an adult now, so obviously we don't have anything like the situations we used to have. So, and now, for example, if there is any tension between us, we are both able to talk about it in a safe, connected way because he knows I am not, and it could be something trivial. For example, not tidying up properly or helping with the washing up. It could be something really simple and trivial that would create tensions, and we're able to say, I'm feeling irritated by this, and what can we do that will make it easier for you to remember to do this, for example, or whatever. And we can do that. Whereas, if we didn't have emotion coaching or the journey we've been on together, and it's opened things up for us, it would have just been, I'd have just suppressed my irritation, or the irritation would have come out in a kind of confrontational way. I'm using very trivial examples here because
but they're not trivial, because they're fundamental examples, because in everyday life, if there's two human beings living together, there's going to be tension, and the tension is going to come from those tiny little things. They're not trivial things, because the tiny little things are reveal the depth of the relationship of what's behind them. And what you say is like, it's not, again, it goes back to the point you made before. It's a blueprint for all human relationships in an ideal way, isn't it? It's like, do you go down the route of blaming the other person and making them wrong for not being for being independent beings rather than what you actually wanted them to be? Or do you respect them as human beings and you say, okay, this is difficult for me, but it's difficult for you as well. I can see that. So let's put all of our difficulties onto the table and let's build a solution that's the best fit for everybody.
And that's exactly what we do now. And we now have this calm, for the most part, calm, soothing, connected relationship, which makes me want to cry in a way.
Yeah.
It's compared to this angst-ridden, tense,
yes,
challenging, disconnected relationship we had, and it's transformative. You talk about transforming autism.
Yeah.
It's transformative.
That's what's happened in your case. It's like the whole experience of bringing up an autistic child, and his experience of life has been transformed as well.
It absolutely is transformative,
and because you've got the contrast, it's almost like you can appreciate you can appreciate how special that is. And you can be actually much more grateful for your relationship with your child than you otherwise would be able to.
He's just this sweet, gentle boy. Whereas when he was younger, I would never have described him in that way. No. I would have sort of said, "Oh, Cameron, oh yeah, he's my challenge," and we say these throwaway lines, but they're weighted with meaning and feelings. And now the first words that come is my sweet, gentle boy. So, and he's 28, so he's a grown up.
Well, that's beautiful. That's really
it's beautiful. It is a beautiful change, for us both and for my own well-being, let alone his, and so on. And there were times I thought we would never be in that space and place together. So I'll just give you an example, if I may, of how I now understand how he thought differently. So he will now talk about how when he was growing up, every social encounter was a horror show for him. That's how he's described it, a horror show. And it was masked. It wasn't obvious to me or to others, but that sort of perception and the way in which he processes social cues and social information, I now realize was different to how other people might process social information. So he tells me, and I know that every autistic person is different in the way that every human is different. So I'm not saying that he is representing any particular autistic person, but this was his world and his journey. So, for example, if he was never really interested in watching films or programs or sitcoms, because he now tells me that he found it overwhelming. It was too much information and too much to process. So he creates subplots. He creates his own story of what's going on, which I found fascinating. And so it's this sort of understanding now that me not recognizing that social relationships were very challenging for him why it's so transformative now. So, for example, if we have a family event, and we had a very tragic family bereavement recently, and me understanding that that my son he's called Cameron, can only cope for so long, so much with these social gatherings, and understanding that and helping my family to understand that he's not being bolshy or unsociable or grumpy or he's a difficult person, but this is how his brain processes social information that is exhausting to him. And therefore we need to make it into bite-sized, tolerable amounts. And that's what we do now. We accommodate his needs,
yes,
without any judgment.
And I think there is some commonality as well. You know, a lot of autistic people do have that sort of very sort of, I have the same. It's with the, you know, when I'm in a social situation or I see social situations or I hear a story, and, you know, if you harness it in a different way, it could become a great creative gift. So like for me, it happens whenever I've heard music, any sort of music, I've heard many, many more layers in the music than were actually there. And instead of letting it overwhelm me, last year at the age of 52, I started composing classical music, and I just jumped straight in at the deep end without any training or anything, because the sounds were all there, you know, all of these different layers. I have a lifetime of sort of building them up, then they sort of just came to the fore. So it's, it can be, you can almost like turn, even just to see what looks like a negative, you know, you say, oh, poor boy, he's overstimulated. Actually, see it in a different way. You say, look how sensitive he is. Look how creative he is. Look how the details are so precise for him. Look how fine-tuned his perception is. Now, either we could respect that, you know, by giving him, you know, shielding him from the worst sort of overstimulation that everybody else seems to enjoy, and giving him the opportunity to sort of manage and bring out the best of that perception that he has. Or we could demand that he, you know, forces himself to habituate himself to this overwhelm and sort of blunt all of the advantages of that skill that he's got.
Absolutely, Guy. And I love your story about the music. My son, one of my favorite things in the world is he comes into the living room and he just starts playing music on the piano. And it's one of my most peaceful, regulating experiences. So yes, you're right. He does the same. He sees and perceives things in a different way. And it's a strength. It's not a deficit. And it means that, you know, his increased sensitivity to others' moods is a strength. Because, you know, often with humans, we're too insensitive to others' feelings and others' needs and so on. So if anything, it's a strength. So I agree with you about the strength-based approach and understanding that we're all humans, you know, and we're all different, and we're different in different ways, and we're the same in some ways. And rather than seeing this group over there is that and this group over there is that, it's just we're all of us together, different people. Yeah.
The spectrum of humanity.
Yes, absolutely.
And so for the benefit of, you know, parents watching this who may be at, you know, whatever stage of their journey, am I right in understanding you to say that you know, so this emotion coaching is a set of techniques, but the fundamental principle, it begins and ends with to accept the child.
Oh, yeah. It is absolutely that all feelings, all desires are okay, are normal and natural. How they manifest may not be okay. If they're throwing and hitting and screaming, you know, or whatever, maybe that's not okay. But you can go on a journey to get to a place and space where they feel safe enough to find a way forward.
Because the raw stimulus in the world, I guess, is not enough to get them to that place where they're, you know, displaying behaviors which are potentially damaging to other people. That comes from being invalidated from them expressing their initial feelings and being repeatedly invalidated in terms of who they are, and you know, told that they're wrong and they're not good. And then you know, what can they do? What can they do with their emotions when they're given that message?
Can I give you another lovely example? This isn't
Please.
my son, but in the work that we've done with autistic children and young people and adults, there was a boy who was in key stage 2, so I think he was about 8. He dysregulated very easily and hit other children when he, became overwhelmed, which we now know is just a stress response. And the teaching assistant that was supporting him, because he had the support in the school, he was in mainstream, and she went on a journey with him of using emotion coaching. So he would be dysregulated and wanting to lash out, and she would be calming and soothing him to say, I know you're angry, you're safe, I'm here, I understand, you're not feeling okay. Now, when she started using that with him, she noticed he calmed more quickly. She reminded him about the school rules. She tried to problem solve with him to say, when you're feeling like this, do this instead. But he kind of wasn't really, he was verbal, but didn't communicate very much. So she just thought, okay, well, at least he's just feeling calmer. So she carried on using emotion coaching. Now, that's the other thing. People want quick fixes. Sometimes they happen, but for most children, and especially if you're talking about, if we're different people processing things in different ways, we need time. Even just to learn a language, it takes years, even though you're spoken to thousands of times. And if you have different processing ways of processing information, then it may take longer, for example. So we have to understand that self-regulation in any person is going to take years. Like it takes years to learn to speak fluently, let alone learn to read and write. So it didn't take years for this child, but it took a couple of months of consistently validating, calming, acknowledging, soothing. We talk about flipping the lid, so he would flip his lid and she would calm and soothe him to put the lid back on. The emotion coaching website has lots of free resources, free information. It's not for profit. You could just go to the website if you want to find out.
And we'll put a load of links in the description as where people can find information about that. But that's a really important, really crucial point that you raise, because parents can easily get disheartened if whatever they're doing, whether it's emotion coaching or something else, if there aren't instant results. And it's easy to forget that a child is how they are. They're in the state or any human being is in the state that they're in at this moment because of everything that's happened through their whole lives. And you create the future by what you do now, how you change things now. But it's not an instant change. People have to work through, people have to get used to the idea that it's safe, and they have to sort of see the good reaction to them enough times for them to be able to trust it. And you're not necessarily getting the feedback during those times that it's going okay. So you've got to actually have the confidence to stay with the change, don't you?
Absolutely, guys. Like anyone learning to drive a car, you look at any late teenager learning to drive a car, it's hesitant, it's uncertain, it takes time, they're scared, they've got to feel confident. And then with practice, they learn to do it. And then it gets to a point where our brains habituate to it and we don't even have to think about it. So this is the same with our behavior. Self-regulation actually takes 20 plus years to develop, in fact. And some people never achieve it. So so this little boy, just to finish that story, after about 2 months of using emotion coaching, whenever he was in a stressed state, he came up to her one day and he took her face in his hands like this and said, "Can you see I'm angry?" And it was like a eureka moment. And another weeping moment, this TA said, I just wanted to cry because she said the dots got joined up. Those repeated experiences of being calmed and soothed started to build an infrastructure in his brain, like we learn words or like we learn anything. And he was one day able to do it, just like one day you can walk, but you practice on your own. but you start to build up your strength and your ability, and you hold someone's hand and you're supported, and then one day you do it. And I'm not saying it's like that for every child, but for this child who was autistic, it was like his eureka moment where all that input, all that information kind of helped him to start to say, this is anger. When I'm angry, I tell someone how I'm feeling. And that's what happened. And I've got other lovely stories. Another autistic child, he was sort of more year 6 age, so more 11 years old. He talked about seeing red. That became his language for when he was feeling what he was feeling, his overwhelm. He said, I see red. And they got into a little mantra of, I see red. When I see red, I do this instead. But it needs all that input beforehand of validating and acknowledging and looking under that iceberg and knowing that, yes, we've got to sort out the behavior, but in that moment, what they need is calming and putting the lid back on. And that builds the infrastructure for self-regulation, literally in our brain and body.
Wonderful. No, this is all really good stuff, Janet. Now, listen, when at the end of each interview, I ask everybody the same 3 questions. These are sort of almost quick fire questions, although they're quite big ones. The first one is that elusive question. Everybody has a personal answer to it. In your experience, in your understanding, what actually is autism?
Well, again, I see this mostly through my lens as a parent, but also in the work that I've done with autistic children. But I would say autism is just people who think in particular ways and process information in particular ways. That's it.
Yeah. Okay, good. And I know we've talked about this quite a lot already, and I think I know what your answer to this is going to be. But I'm going to ask you anyway. What one message would you like parents of autistic children to remember to best support their children?
Look beneath the behavior. Don't take the surface behavior as a judgment of that child. Look beneath to see what's going on here, what's happening here, what are they feeling, how can I help them feel safe again, and then what might be going on in their processing or in their sensory sensitivities that may be eliciting the stress response.
Wonderful. And finally, Janet, in your ideal world, how is autism accepted and integrated?
Oh, wow, that's such a big question. But I think for me, it isn't about having this group of people over here and that group of people over there, and they're autistic and they've got ADHD. I've got a mild ADHD brain, but why do we need to label it in that way? Why don't we just say we're all humans, and in the same way that we look different, we might have different coloring, different, whatever, different shapes, different sizes. We also think differently, and we have different temperaments, and some of us process information in that way, and some of us process information in that way. And, that bit we might be good at, and on that bit we might not be. And that's all we are. We're all just human beings, and we're all different, but also the same as well. So I think that's how, for me, that would be the ideal world. But I think
proper neurodiversity, proper understanding of neurodiversity.
Absolutely. And I think by the time, I think it's, we're still not there, but we're better than we were, when my son was young. And I think as time goes on, this is how it will be. And it won't be a deficit model. It'll be a strengths-based model of how we support people and all humans. And the great thing about emotion coaching is it's universal. It's for all human relationships in the way that you've described. So, yeah. So,
Janet, it's been really wonderful talking to you. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching The Beautiful Reality of Autism, and we'll see you next time.